Hi, friends. Welcome to Bar of the Conference. I'm your host, Derrick Scott III. I'm excited about these pilot episodes as we began this podcast project, and I'm really grateful to my friend Jeremy Smith for being willing to be a part of one of the first conversations. Reverend Jeremy Smith is an elder in the greater Northwest area of the UMC. He's a pastor, partner, parent, blogger, and leading voice in the denomination. He's been blogging at Hacking Christianity for 15 years and is currently the pastor of First United Methodist Church in downtown Seattle. I enjoyed this conversation with Jeremy as he sort of unpacked for us the good news and the bad news as we head into a new year, a year that is sure to bring many twists and turns for the United Methodist Church, particularly in the U.S. But I'm really grateful for Jeremy's framing of this moment. He frames it as the United Methodist Church's longest night, and that light is coming. And I think it's going to be really helpful, challenging, but also encouraging for us as we begin to think about what we need to do, and more importantly, who we want to be as we move forward as the United Methodist Church. So grab your notebooks. I think you're going to really enjoy this and find it as helpful as I did. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. My discussion with Reverend Jeremy Smith. Reverend Jeremy Smith, how are you doing today, my friend?
I'm doing well, my friend Derrick. How are you doing out there in Florida?
I am good. We are recording this on the third day of Christmastide. I believe that's what it is. So
it is.
Very grateful for your willingness to join me today, talking about all things United Methodist and the year ahead that we are about to go into. Probably going to be an interesting year, to say the least, for United Methodism. And I was just really grateful that you were willing to just give me a few minutes of your time, and let's talk about some of the things that we should be thinking about as we go into this next year, as we prepare probably for more congregations across the connection to disaffiliate, but also to be thinking about the future of the United Methodist Church.
Amen. And gosh, it's great to geek out with you today, Derrick, and be able to think through these things. Sometimes they process in our heads, and it's always better to process with somebody else. And as we I'm in Seattle, you're in Florida. We're kind of, the longest flight possible between the two of us. But it's good to think about both the spectrum of what Methodism looks like in America and globally.
Absolutely.
So this is a great thing to be together with you. Thank you for this opportunity.
Well, Jeremy, let's just jump right in. I was really grateful that you because of your blogging and your engagement over, did I hear you tell me 15 years of this sort of deeper engagement into the way that our church is structured and how we gather? Am I correct in that with Hacking Christianity?
In March 2023 is 15 years of blogging.
Gosh, and so many of us are grateful for your work. It's partly why I wanted to get you in some of the first episodes of this new podcast. So tell me, what's the good news? What are the things that are really good and hopeful that those who intend to stay in the United Methodist Church and those who are working towards a future for the United Methodist Church, what are the good things that we should be thinking about, that you think we should be thinking about?
A week ago was from this recording was the longest night service, where we remember that the days that were getting bleaker and bleaker have now transitioned into the days that are getting brighter and brighter. And that's the way I think about 2023 for the Methodist Church, for the United Methodist Church, is that we had a rough 2022. There was a lot of ups and downs, or a lot of unexpected, lots of unknowns, huge disinformation campaigns. And so we went through, we had a lot of churches that were reacting impulsively rather than responding slowly and critically. And a lot of churches that were going to leave anyway. And so I think that's the way how I think about where we are now, is that we're in the time when the days are going to get brighter. We're going to have rough days. We're going to have difficult days, but I do think that 2023 is when things start we find we're singing a new song in the United Methodist Church, and it's just how do we get the word out to more people. I think the reason why I think that is that we really saw the limit of we saw the ceiling of the separatist movement's power this past year. You think about, let's wind back the clock to 2018. 2018, traditionalists and conservatives, they were talking about how they owned the Judicial Council. They talked about how bishops were afraid to oppose them, to go against them. They had clergy majorities in our most populous states in America, and so they walk into the 2019 General Conference with that attitude, and they squandered it, Derrick, and to pass the traditionalist plan. And then they saw everything start to fall apart. They lost majorities in General Conference delegations. Especially in the past year, 2022, the Judicial Council has been death on everything that they have wanted, that the traditionalists and WCA, GMC folks have wanted.
Right. I wonder, why do you think they squandered? I mean, what did they miss? Because I would think that at 2019, General Conference 2019, like that should have been a new S curve, maybe, like if I could say it that way. But we rolled into annual conference season of 2019, and even in my home conference, Florida, we saw a very strong response, and some might even say a reaction to the passing of the traditional plan. Mm-hmm. So what happened, do you think, between February and June in sort of the WCA camp that was the misstep? And we weren't invited to those meetings, obviously.
No, we weren't, but I don't think the misstep was in between February and June. I think it was walking into that February conference with an attitude of hostage negotiation rather than bargaining and rather than conferencing. I think they came in with this big traditional plan. And remember, we only passed maybe 2/3 of the traditional plan. The original one gave a lot more powers and abilities to kick out progressives at the annual conference level. The original legislation could dismiss an entire annual conference. And so if we had passed all of it, it would have strengthened the traditionalist position at every level of the United Methodist Church. Wow. Thankfully, we did not. Thankfully, we voted down some things, and some things were removed by Judicial Council action, things like that. But I think they came in with this attitude of one of their most recent conferences was called "More Than Conquerors," because they love their colonial mindset, and that's just the mentality. It is solely on the leadership of the renewal groups, WCA, what would become the GMC, that instead of coming in with, let's come up with a decision to divide, something like the protocol, or whatever, then we, again, of course we're looking back, but the mentality is, you just couldn't, when you're so fixated on your own mentality, you can't, it's hard to step away from it. And so that's why I think that there wasn't too much that shifted after that conference. It was just that, people woke up, the centrists and the megachurch centrists kind of woke up and said, whoa, this is bad. I need to stop, posturing from the middle, at least some of them.
Yeah.
So I think that was, so I think that it was a wake up call, but it was one that I welcomed. especially. So I think that all that, so you had all these majorities, walking into that, and then you start losing judicial council cases this past year. 2022, one of the bright spots was every anti-gay bishop in America is gone as of January 1st. Now there are still there's still an antagonistic bishop, at least one, probably two left. Going to Mississippi and one other place. But I think that but we elected the most diverse class of bishops in America in history. And we elected a female bishop in the Philippines. I mean, there's a lot to celebrate in the Episcopal branch of things.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, one piece of good news that we take with us into 2023 is that in some respects the what could have been a traditionalist or conservative majority, at least in the ways of our structure and the way power sort of works out in our structure, we saw the limits of it, and it's sort of like if it fizzled. I think in some respects, depending on where you are, the fizzle maybe it's a little bit slower and not as fizzly. But in the coming year, I think we'll be spending less and less of our time trying to keep traditionalists from dominating the United Methodist conversation. And I don't think that I know, at least in my jurisdiction, the goal is not to not have traditionalists in our church.
No.
But the goal is to be in ministry with those who have a traditional, what some would call an orthodox, I don't know if that's the best term, but those who hold to a more historic understanding, evangelical historic understanding of Wesleyan theology and how that works out in the United Methodist Church. We'll spend less time trying to keep them from dominating all the spaces, and we'll get to spend more time figuring out how to be in ministry with those who hold to those historic Wesleyan evangelical views. Would you agree with me there?
I agree. I mean, and that happens on the ground all the time. I'm originally from Oklahoma. I was a member of the Oklahoma Annual Conference until 2014-ish. And so my first 8 years of ministry was a member of the Oklahoma Annual Conference. When I was serving a rural appointment, we would do district camps together, and the deans would be all very diverse. The curriculum writing teams would be very diverse. And when you're in those rooms together, you find common ground.
Yeah.
When you're face to face with people, it's this. So I think that, even as loud as the upper levels are of the different renewal groups about incompatibility, I think that on the ground we find a lot more in common, and that is why these disaffiliations are so emotional, because these are folks that you did camp with, and you can't believe that their church is being led out of the denomination by, these reactionary forces and separatist powers.
So let's go there, because it feels like that's not going to be good news for us. The number of disaffiliations and sort of the way that look. I mean, we know that the folks at IRD are definitely keeping a tally. I'm sure that the WCA is keeping their own tally as well. Is there any kind of good news in the fact that we have a number of churches, hundreds of churches that are disaffiliating and intend to disaffiliate over the next years? Any silver lining in that piece?
I think that there's a little bit, Derrick. I think the first is that with those disaffiliations, it does allow annual conferences to enact policies and procedures and elect delegates and leadership that are more reflective of their new majorities, that are more progressive and more and folks that gather respect from all sides of the aisle. You're going to find them, higher up, which is great. So I think that I think that's good. Or I'm not really sure. It may take some time to see that, though, as annual conferences reallocate and recalculate. I'm still waiting on 2021 numbers from GCFA, so you can imagine that it takes a while to get through all these statistics for some reason. But
Yeah.
I think that so that's it. But the um, uh, but the reason why did I say that? Oh, the reason why I want those numbers is because many of the churches that are leaving haven't been paying their apportionments anyway, or have been withholding portions of their giving. And so I don't think we're going to see as huge of a impact on annual conference budgets. I mean, it's going to be, just depending on the conference. I mean, Northwest Texas, Central Texas, that's a different story. But
Yeah.
but I think that the point is that the finances are good. Well, I guess we'll talk finances in just a minute. But the good news is that there's a sense that that there's a sense of inevitability to some of these churches. Some of these movements have been withholding from Methodism for a long time, both apportionments and leadership and enthusiasm, of not being supportive of connectionalism, of any of those things for a long time. And so removing those voices from inside the house lets us put out those fires a little bit easier.
Yeah.
So I think that's the piece that I'm taking. But of course, I'm speaking from a privileged place in the Northwest, where the number of churches that are going to disaffiliate, are probably less than a dozen. And I think that a good reason for that is that we have learned how to do life together. And it's not across the board, but there's going to be a lot of annual conferences that are going to find a new way of what life together looks like when it's more like conferencing and less like hostage negotiation.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate your continued image of the longest night. I do think that possibly for, my hope is that particularly in the Southeastern jurisdiction and the South Central jurisdiction, that we are on the other side of the longest night. I fear that we may not be as on the other side of midnight as much as we would like in this region, but
the light is coming.
The light is coming, and I do think so. And I think because I've spent so many years in campus ministry, I see some opportunities even in the midst of just the heartbreak of seeing colleagues and congregations disaffiliate. One thing, and I'd love to get your take on this. I look at some of the churches that are disaffiliating here in Florida, and one in particular. Watch this congregation from the time it was planted in the late 90s to where it is today. And I don't think there was ever an effort for it to be a connectional United Methodist Church. From its early days, I just wonder, I wonder how intentional the distance between that congregation and the annual conference was, because there just seemed to be a lot of distance. And so my thought is, as much as I hate to see them disaffiliate, I am also aware that even in the conversation of 2553, their issue with their feeling of it being unfair is rooted in a lack of understanding of how the UMC actually works. And in that sense, I don't blame them for thinking that it's unfair, because they I don't know if there's a book of discipline in their building. And I don't mean that as any kind of shade or anything like that. I don't know if they're actually a United Methodist congregation, if they ever were. And so there's a part of me that's as much as I hate to see them leave, I'm wondering if it's actually in the best interest. And is this where I possibly get in trouble? But I do wonder if it's in the best interest of everybody for them to disaffiliate. Because
It is. I mean, for being a Big Tent denomination means that you've got folks at all ends of the tent, and that there are folks that have intentionally, either for years or decades, stepped outside of the tent in their practice of connectionalism. It's not about belief. It's not about it's not about those sort of things. It's about our practice of connectionalism, and that takes intentionality from both the pastor. It takes intentionality from the district superintendent and from the conference officials to hold that church accountable when they don't. Because there are a lot of these churches that, if we watched over one another in love a little bit better, that I think that we would have seen all these things coming. And been able to help and moderate. If the lay leaders of that church were connected with the lay leaders of other churches, what could they have absorbed and brought back to their church? Because if the lay leadership can't transform a church, there's a problem with that church.
Right.
I'm speaking to a lay person, so
I'm a key lay person in my local congregation, and so I feel all of these words you're saying. Yeah, I really appreciate your image of the longest night as we're talking about this good news, and I think that it may be that we have to, in thinking about the good news that we take into 2023 for the UMC, we do have to take it from the perspective of where we are right now. That, as you said, the light is coming. It's such a great image. So, since the light is coming, what might be the bad news that we need to reconcile ourselves to as we go into 2023?
I remember going through the ordination process, people said, you need to state your convictions, and you need to, I was going through it in Oklahoma, which is more conservative. They said, you need to state your convictions and tell us what you really believe. And the reason why they say that is because they want you to, reveal, oh no, he's a progressive. And I'm like, I went to Boston University. Come on. You already knew this. I have a blog. You already knew this. But it's that clarity and conviction that has a bit of a cost, So the U.S. decided its path forward, which is inclusive. And 2023 should be the year that we begin to transition away from worrying about who is leaving and focusing instead on who we can bring in, and how we can do that. And I think the two barriers to that, as we go into, as we're in 2023, are around finances and enthusiasm. So, kind of the finance piece, with churches, with churches leaving, it's going to be a rough transition period for folks that had either large churches leaving, whether they're paying their full apportionment or not. A lot of churches didn't pay their full apportionment, so it's not that big of an impact on annual conference operations. It will result likely in larger apportionments for everyone else because, if you're dividing by 300 the annual conference budget, even though you're not going to get it, and then you're dividing by 200 the annual conference budget, everyone goes up, and that's going to be a narrative to figure out in 2023. So figuring out those finances both at the legislative level, at the annual conference level, and then trickling up to the general church as they put together what their new budget's going to look like for 2024 and beyond. So I think that the finances piece is a big one, and it's just time to adjust expectations, and for the larger churches to learn from smaller churches conferences about how do they operate. How does I came from Oregon, Idaho, which has very few conference staff compared to Oklahoma, where it seems like every middle-aged white guy, that's where they retire from, is from the annual conference. This is a place for real talk, right, Derrick? Okay.
Yeah, come on.
And so those the conferences, so seeing conferences as cushy positions is going to be gone. And so everybody, is going to have to, really be fully invested in what's new in the United Methodist Church. And so that's going to be a rough transition period, but, there are folks to learn from of smaller annual conferences. How do we operate? I think the journal boards and agencies have gone through this for years and decades with the kind of the iron fist that the conservatives and traditionalists had on the boards and agencies on their funding. And so they've already had to learn how to do more with less. And I think that that's what we're going to figure out how to do as United Methodists. But it is going to be bad news in the short term, especially 2023, as things really have to get settled more for 2024 and beyond.
What do you see for agencies in that? And also our more global financial apparatus, like how do you think all of that's going to be impacted with this decrease in connectional giving because of disaffiliations and things like that?
Sure. I think in the short term, some agencies and places are going to pull from their reserves to keep operating going, but that's not a sustainable strategy. I think that overall, I think, because every agency believes in the work that they do, that they figure out how to structure for that work. Sometimes that means reducing the number of board members to cut costs. Sometimes that means going to only virtual meetings for their board members. I'm on one of the agencies and commissions that has gone to only virtual for their board meetings, which certainly saves a lot of cash. But I think that. But there's also needing ways that need to expand in the coming years. So I think that I'm not really sure what it looks like exactly for the agencies and commissions. But I do think that I know that they're filled with people that believe in the work they do, and they're going to figure it out.
Yeah. How do you think our global giving is going to be impacted?
Every annual, you always have to look at the global. You have to start locally. What are the how's the giving happening in our churches? Are our churches able to pay their apportionments? Are they able to give to our common work together? We saw an uptick during the pandemic. Is that sustainable? And what does that look like? And again, if annual conferences are paying their apportionments using reserve funds, that's not a sustainable strategy.
Right.
And so I think that global giving will continue, but that's only if we deal with the second problem that I see, which is around an enthusiasm gap.
Okay, let's go there because I have enough heartburn from the finances.
Yeah, I know. That's all theory. The enthusiasm really is real. I mean, I think that there's it is, it's that phrase, it is easier to birth new life than to raise the dead.
Yeah.
And that's certainly true in this season where you have churches that are disaffiliating because they see only death in the United Methodist Church, and they have these wild fields of new life with other associations or denominations or on their own because they were congregational anyway. And so I think that there's it doesn't feel good to be the leftovers, Derrick. And that's the heart work that the church has felt, at various times during 2022. And I hope that 2023 is the year when we start to see, we aren't the leftovers. This is an Easter moment. We've gone through the dark night. We've gone through the longest night. We've gone through Good Friday, and there is resurrection on the other end. That we are a resurrection people, an Easter people, and that 2023 may be a year of Resurrection Sundays, where each time we get together, we celebrate that. Hey, there's something new on the other side.
Yeah.
And And so in some ways, I don't understand the gap. I think that the BUMC campaign by the
UMCOM.
UMCOM, I think has the right intentions and the right strategy, because it wasn't but we didn't need to focus on who other people were or how other people were being wrong, because it was never going to be a marketing contest between the Global Methodist Church and the United Methodist Church. It's going to be between them and the Collegiate Association and the Free Methodists and the Locked Up Methodists and all these different groups. So it didn't make sense to just focus on one. We needed to focus on who we were as a church. It makes sense to me, but I haven't seen. But I think that the results of that are mixed so far. And I'm hoping that 2023 is a year when we can see who we are, or who we want to be, UMC, and less the fear of what we lost in 2022. And so I think that we just needed an enthusiasm gap year, where everything is going to be just terrible in 2022, but we don't have to stay there. We don't have to stay in that space. We can be proud of our local church and what they're doing. We can celebrate the successes of other churches across our annual conference at the conference level, and we can celebrate the common work that we can do together that even the Global Methodist Church can't replicate and won't replicate.
Right. Yeah, I take your point about sort of the limits at times of broad campaigns and their ability to really speak to sort of these felt needs, just because they are so broad. And I've said in some meetings that I've been in that I just think that it's hard, because this is what I've said. There's 12 or 13 million United Methodists in the world, and there's 13 or 14 million ways to be United Methodist. And
at least.
And so then trying to create a campaign that sort of speaks to all of those different ways of thinking and living and ideas of what faith, it's just a hard job. And if anything, it seems to me that the GMC has an easier job of framing a narrative that works for a very specific type of currently United Methodist, soon to not be United Methodist. So that's a thought there. And then I also wonder, just as far as like the enthusiasm gap, I appreciate that kind of way of thinking about it too. I wonder if some of that is the exhaustion that has come from the fact that this is not the only polarizing issue happening for U.S. United Methodists at the moment, right?
Yeah.
And in some respects, I don't know if anybody has really filled their enthusiasm gap. I mean, this last election cycle of the midterms, I think you saw the enthusiasm gap in all of the different political spaces. And so I wonder if some of that is that, unfortunately, all of these fortunes are tied together.
It is. And people just want I think people are most enthusiastic about creating a space where they no longer have to have these conversations anymore. They want to create a space where they don't have to talk about Methodist tension, but maybe they also don't want to talk about, about systematic racism either, and be away from a agency or an annual conference or an obnoxious lay leader that talks about such things, or that talks about inclusion of LGBTQIA plus persons. They want, I think we want our snuggle blankets, and to be comforted. But that doesn't lead to discipleship.
Yeah.
That leads to holy solitaries, which is the most like anti-Wesleyan thing that there can be. And so my hope is wherever people end up, that they don't use this as an excuse to step away from those other critical conversations. I would be thrilled if a church left the United Methodist Church and became a loud, anti-racist, independent church. Do it. That's amazing, but I fear that a lot of these churches are wanting to walk away from all three conversations simultaneously. And that's not healthy or good.
We're going to digest that bad news and take a quick break.
Amen.
So, Jeremy, what's top of mind for you? And what would you love for United Methodists generally, but specifically those who are delegates, those who are leaders in their conferences, as well as their districts? What are you thinking that we should be paying attention to?
Those are great questions, Derrick. I think that the first one that comes to mind really goes back to our finances conversation, is that, as annual conference are figuring out how to balance budgets, I hope that they do so without eroding our connections. I'm a big believer that that there is a direct link between bishops that pulled back on annual conference obligations of clergy, that districts that held back on holding events, that annual conferences stopped asking and requiring participation by their leaders, that there's a direct link between regions that did that sort of cut back on our connectionalism, reduce the number of districts, all those different things, had fewer connections with each other, fewer people watching over love. Those are the regions that have had the most disaffiliations. I'm not sure if that's true across the board. I know it's true in Central Texas. And I'd love to see more data to see if it's others, because if we it's not popular, but having more middle management in Methodism is better, not worse. Having more district superintendents, more resources at the district level, more opportunities for people in similar mission fields to get together, rather than centralizing resources at annual conference level that then benefit everybody at the same level. I think those are the ones that tend to get cut the earliest. But I really feel like that's a problem. The district is a mission field too, and if you don't invest in your mission field, it's not just it's not just a bureaucratic way to put things together. It really is a mission field, and we need to treat it like that. Derrick, I mean, the conviction that I have is that connectionalism is not lean. It's not something we cut back on. It's a necessary expense to create our life together, especially when our life together is trying to be torn apart by separatist powers.
Yeah.
And even though we may have theological conservatives that are leaving, or ideological conservatives that are leaving United Methodism, we have plenty of fiscal conservatives across the aisles. And so I think that connectionalism requires investment. And so the thing to keep in mind this next year is as folks are trying to balance budgets, that they find ways to do that don't diminish our connectional qualities. And that's a tough lift, but we've got a ton of smart people in the church that could figure it out and can learn from each other.
Wow. How do we think differently about connectional giving? And in this way, like, I get the sense that maybe the quote unquote fiscal conservatives within that are across the aisle are like, we don't have the funds, and so let's just pull back, as opposed to, if we're going to really fulfill the mission and the purposes that we believe God has called us into, that means we're going to have to make an investment in our denomination. How do we get there? How do we begin to think about the future in those ways, that the future is not just we need more young people, we need more diverse clergy. We also need deeper investment.
I think that there's both wisdom from the secular world and there's theological wisdom from the church world as well. In the secular world, whenever you have trouble in a company or corporation, you don't cut the marketing department. You keep that, you got to keep that one fully staffed. And I think that for fiscal conservatives, it's helpful to think of connectionalism as the marketing department. We're the ones that communicate the values to each other, to hold each other, to watch over one another in love. And so I think that cutting back on connectionalism is cutting back on the marketing. It's just like in a local church that, cutting staff is cutting marketing and cutting connections. And I would hope that fiscal conservatives of all ideologies would see that. But I also think that there is a space this next year that I hope that there's more intentional work done on thinking through these things as Wesleyans and theologically. What does connectionalism mean to us? What did it mean to Wesley? What are the ways that connectionalism under Wesley was flawed and definitely needed upgrading? And what are the practices of connectionalism that we have now that have led us to a different understanding of what that looked like? We've seen Wesleyan accountability be so distorted by traditionalists that I think that we need some time we just need a reset to figure out what things are and what we really are. So that's sort of my first thought to your question, Derrick, about what should we hold in mind is that connectionalism costs money and we shouldn't cut those things from our budget in some way. I think that's more of an annual conference question. I think for the at the level of the episcopacy, with all the bishops working together, new bishops coming in. Again, the most diverse and inclusive class of bishops we've had in at least recent memory. And I'm really excited about that, but I don't want us to squander this opportunity either. We just talked about the traditionalists squandering their power in 2019. We've got a moment here when the bishops could say as one voice, we will no longer enforce the anti-gay provisions in the discipline. Boom. That there is sin at the heart of the discipline. You can't spell discipline without sin. And there are these 7 lines or whatever that we will no longer enforce, that we've been led by the Spirit to do this. And of course, that's easy for me to say, not at the bishop's table, but if they really want to, show that, the church in the U.S. has chosen the direction of inclusion, and it would be nice to do to just say, well, if the church has chosen this, then we're going to be the ones that put it into practice. And of course, that doesn't take out everything. It doesn't take out some of the funding things. But gosh, if the bishops would say that as one voice, I think we'd be in a much better position going into 2024, again, as people who have clarity around our convictions. I'm very happy. I'm very happy to do that. I have a less. I would love to see them have less dallying with the separatists, less, accommodating of them. But that may be an unrealistic expectation. But we can't all have a former Floridian North Georgia bishop who's in Bishop Sue's going to
Virginia now.
Virginia,
And Florida is getting Virginia's nominee, Tom Berlin.
There you go. All right.
Robin Deese is actually headed to North Georgia, which was a bit of a wild card this year at Southeastern Jurisdictional Conference.
That's
Jeremy, I appreciate that you name, and I try to name, I'm not a bishop, not even clergy. And so, my desires or my suggestions to how I think the episcopacy should work really comes from a place of not knowing the pressures of what it means to be a bishop, the variables that they're holding. But I do wonder, there was so much excitement around this class of nominees that were elected to the episcopacy, not just in the U.S., but I think across the global connection of the UMC. I think that there was some appreciation for the individuals who were elected. So I guess this kind of gets to that enthusiasm gap. That to me feels like a bit of a height in the as far as enthusiasm across the connection, and yet I do fear that these incredible individuals, this super diverse class, sort of rolls into the episcopacy and again, this is said from a person who's not in the room at all, but sort of sinks into a passivity that we've seen in some of our Episcopal leaders. Not all of our Episcopal leaders.
No, you're right.
And so the Episcopal leaders that are listening, you can put yourself in the category of the not all. Because I'm not talking about you.
Listen to this podcast, you are not all.
You're not, but
yeah,
like we've seen that like I feel like this has been the narrative that sometimes these individuals sort of on their road to their long road, years of service and ministry, that then takes a new phase at the episcopacy. There feels like a passivity that sometimes at least that's the experience of many of us on the ground. So what do you I think you agree with me on this. How might we on the ground help not just the new class of leaders, but all of our bishops reject that passivity?
Yeah, it really is a lot of work with our established leaders. Who are the active bishops that have been around for a while, that can now see a new possibility. The incoming class of bishops, I'm not as concerned about them, but it's the folks that know and understand what it means to be a bishop. For the past, at least 6 years. What does that look like? And how can they practically put things into action? And so I think that it's really up to our annual conference leaderships to talk with the bishops who maybe aren't moving. Maybe they are in the same places. Maybe they've been a bishop for a while, or they've just been a bishop for 6 years, and say, this is the moment. There's, we've got a, what's the Lin-Manuel line? It's not a moment, it's a movement. Well,
okay,
yeah. But this actually is the moment for the movement. And so I really think that the change of heart has to come from established relationships with their established bishops and saying, look, if you step out this way, I'm there for you. Our annual conference is going to be behind you. We have a new annual conference with less people that are obnoxious. We want to stand with you. So I really think that, as you, Derrick, as you meet with other conference leaders, it really is, how can you provide that assurance to our Episcopal leaders that if they step out, that they've got their conference behind them? And that really, I really think that work needs to be done with established leaders and established relationships rather than expecting the new people to do everything. We see that in the House of Representatives with a fiery new class that was able to push things, but wasn't able to, get past the more moderate hierarchy in some ways. But we're still able to find the celebrations together. So I think that, working with the bishops, is really important. I think working with annual conference, budgets and preserving our connectionalism is really important. I guess I do have one more question that I'm still trying to figure out myself, Derrick, is trying to find clarity on whether annual conferences can fill vacancies in their general conference delegations. We just had the Judicial Council said that we did not have to have new elections, which is great. The General Conference has not called for new elections, so no like new elections of our current delegates. But there's still the question of vacancies. Can we fill vacancies, and especially in annual conferences that have just lost a lot of folks, or again. The overall, there has not been a mass exodus out of United Methodism. There have been some really deep pockets that have lost folks, but I think at the end of the year there's something like 2,500 churches out of 33,000 churches. So that's significant, but it's not a mass exodus.
Right.
So anyway. Side note.
I appreciate that statistic, because that's really those numbers, rather, because that really does help shape. I mean, you hear 2,500 churches, like, oh my gosh, 2,500 of 33,000. It's not as wow. It's not
as wow. And yet in some regions, like in Central Texas and Northwest Texas, it's a huge percentage of them. And. But we've already talked through about how much those folks were actually contributing to connectionalism in the first place. So, and just the opportunities now for new church plants in those regions that no longer have a United Methodist Church in them. What new things could be created, so that we also have that enthusiasm around something new. So I'm excited about those things, Derrick. But again, side notes. Back to the that sort of question about how do we, there are empty seats at the table, and are we able to fill them by having elections about individual seats and reserves and things like that, because some conferences have gone through all their reserves, and because the people who disaffiliated, laity, members of those churches, or clergy that are leaving, and they no longer should have a voice in United Methodism, but that doesn't mean that we should have no voice at all at the table. So my hope is that we find some clarity around that, because I really think that's kind of having annual conferences be more intentional about connectionalism, having annual conferences being intentional about who their leaders are and their delegates, and then bishops being more intentional about their convictions. I think those are all things that I hope that conference leaders keep in mind as they lead through 2023. And Derrick, you're one of them that's offering that leadership, and so I'm certainly in prayer for you as you do that as well.
Man, Jeremy, I appreciate just the time you've given today, and I'm aware of our time, so I don't want to hold you to it. There's so much that we have talked about, and yet so much that we could have added to the plate, but I think this is a good sort of primer to get us into the new year. I'm curious. I want to know if you've got any final thoughts that you'd like to put on the table for us as we come to a close, and would also love to just hear your vision, hope for the future of the UMC, specifically in the U.S. I think that would be really cool to hear as we end this episode. So any final thoughts, and then your vision for the future?
Yeah. I think that 2023 is the year where we start to embrace abundance instead of scarcity. We look at 2022, the narrative was all around who we lost and what we lost and who is leaving, and all those things, which are true and emotional, of course, but we are a people we're a people of abundance, and of an abundance of grace. And I would, if we have been to focus just on the numbers and the money and the politics, that's not what we need. We need to be clear-eyed about those things. But my hope is that we focus more on the abundance. I would love to see more investment in theological guidance around sort of what's the Wesleyan way at this moment. And one of the things that's close to my heart around Wesleyanism is Wesleyan accountability. It's been so distorted and weaponized in recent decades by churches that are that have sent churches and individuals that issue charges across annual conference lines. There's a charge right now against my new bishop coming into the Greater Northwest Episcopal Region, Bishop Cedric Bridgeforth, and it was issued by folks in the South Central and Southeast, and a few folks in Illinois' Great Rivers. And so I'm just like, that's not Wesleyan accountability. Wesleyan accountability is face to face. So my hope is that as we enter this new year, that we both realize how parts of our Wesleyan heritage have been distorted and weaponized to hurt people and to enforce conformity, and instead to go back to what Wesleyan accountability really means, which is watching over one another love, which is face-to-face relationships and accountability. And those are things that are really hard to do when the system. It's really hard to have personal growth when you're sick, and so when you're battling when you're battling something that takes you out of sorts. And so my hope is that as we go into 2023, that we choose that abundance and we choose that those celebrations and ways to get back to take advantage of being a smaller denomination that lets us, have more things face to face, that lets us, value our relationships more, the quality rather than I want us to be a church that celebrates the quality of our Wesleyan relationships rather than the quantity of people in our pews. That doesn't work.
That is beautiful, Jeremy. Sorry, keep going. That was
that was it. That was the soundbite.
Gosh, that was beautiful.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that I'm most excited about in 2023. And I'm really looking forward to the other folks on the podcast that also bring forth those things as well. I'm going to be really interested to listen in these coming weeks. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jeremy. Wow.
We hope you enjoyed the episode. Bar of the Conference is produced by the team at Wesley's Revival, a ministry of Studio Wesley. Subscribe to this show on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or Google platforms so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time.